This is a special presentation brought to you by the Daf Map, based on one of the lectures given by HaRav Yehonasan Berger Shlita. Please check out our other videos and shiurim at www.thedafmap.com.
Today's shiur begins 7 lines from the top of Daf Samach Daled. On the side of the Gemara, you will notice a Nosay, a topic heading. Before we read our topic heading, let us point out we're continuing the topic of Tuma Tsafa. We discussed this in our previous shiur, that if there is a situation of a sheretz that is floating on water, and someone has a doubt as to whether they came into contact with it, we saw a machlokas tanoim, but suffice it to say that even though there's a principle of sofek tuma b'rshus hayochid, when there's a doubt concerning tuma, we are machmir. If you're dealing with tuma tsafa, with something floating, so based on gzeres hakosovs, there's a special leniency. There's a machlokas rishonim that the Gra makes an allusion to on our daf in Os Beis, that holds that the concept of Tuma Tsafa, according to the Rambam, is limited only to shrotzim, not to other forms of Tuma when they are floating and there is a doubt of having had contact with them. That having been said, we say that's the Shitas HaRambam. Other Rishonim expand the concept of Tuma Tsafa to all situations of Tuma, whatever the source of the Tuma is, if the suffix is a suffix, a doubt as having had contact with it, Tumas Maga. We're going to see in our sugya that we're not going to apply a suffix to a case of Tumat Safa to something that would be Metame Ba'oihel, only if the suffix is Be-Maga, contact. So now our note on the side reads as follows: Hakula shel Tumat Safa Shayich rak b'mikrim shel sofek maga. As we mentioned, the leniency concerning floating tuma applies only when the matter of doubt was there physical, direct contact with the item, the source of the tuma. Another point we will see, dovar hanizrak, something that is thrown, it's in flight. The noitzar sofek maga, and an issue of doubt concerning contact with the item while it was in flight. Gam ke nechshav ke mikre shel tumat safa. It is also considered like tumat safa. In other words, safa, which means floating, doesn't mean only floating on the water. You see from here that the concept is tuma that's not stationary on the ground. Now, when we said stationary on the ground, let us mention ahead of time that that's not the only situation where a suffix of tumas maga will present itself as a suffix. What are exactly the guidelines of what is tsafa and what is not tsafa? So we'll see examples in our Gemara through which one can then develop a set of guidelines. So now the Gemara, 7 lines from the top. We open with a Tanaic source, Tonu Rabbanan. Kol hanitlin v'hanigrorin. Items that are moved or dragged, and while they're in movement, there is a doubt as to having had contact with something tohor. Could be taharos, food that needs to maintain purity, or a person. The source of tuma, notice, it's not stationary. It's being carried or dragged by a person. Could be that the source of tuma is attached to a rope or a string, and it's being dragged along, and it might have come into contact with someone standing nearby, or someone was carrying the tumah. So notice, it's not stationary, but its locomotion is based on the fact that a person is moving it. So the source tells us, Sfeikon Tomei, Mipnei Shein Kemunachim. The suffix of having had contact will lead us to rule Tumah. There is defilement because halachically they are considered stationary. They're not considered floating. And why is that? As we said, because a person is the one that has control over it. This expression you can see in the Tosfos, on the second Tosfos from the top. The second to last line of that Tosfos says, Kevon shiyad odom toifes ba ein kan din tumah tzafa. Since a person is in control of it, is holding on to it, though the item is in movement, it does not have the status of tumah tzafa, of floating tumah. We continue in the source, v'hanizrokin, an item that's not in control by the human being. It's true, it was projected by the human being, it was thrown, it was cast by the human being, and is in flight. And while in flight, it might have touched something. Sfeikon tohar. The doubt will be ruled leniently that no tumah. Chutz min kezayis hameis v'hamahil al penei tumah, with the exception of an olive quantity of corpse flesh, or that was thrown. Now, corpse flesh, if you have an olive quantity of it, it will create tumah even without contact, simply by the fact that it passes over something else that is subject to tumah. Tumah will be imposed. And v'amahil al penei tumah, or some taharos, something that needs to remain tohor, was thrown, was cast over a source of tumas meis, v'chol davar shemetama milamala kilamata, and all other things that create tumah from above and from below without direct contact. There are other forms of tumah that have that capacity. La suye, and this comes to include the case of zav v'zova. A zav and zova, these are, zav is a male, a zova a female, that have respective emissions that create tumah. These people become tomei, and if they were to, let us say, sit on a boulder that's positioned over a pit in the ground, and in the pit there are articles of clothing, let's say. Those articles of clothing become tomei. That is called tumah of even misama. We're not going to spend time dealing with that, but one should simply realize that that's a case of tumah that's communicated, that's transferred without actual contact between the zav and the clothing. So if there's a suffix concerning those types of tumah, we're going to rule tomei. They're not categorized as tumah tzafa. We now start a question. Now you'll notice we have a long question marking. And in this long question, notice our marked page is quite marked. There are numbers. You see numbers running down the right-hand side of the Gemara text. Numbers 1 through 7. Take note of the fact that 1 through 4 are circled and the last 3 have diamonds around them. There's a reason for that. On the other side of on the margin of the Gemara, we have under our Nosay, our topic heading, we've written Sidra Shel She'elos, a series of questions, Be'inyan Tumah Tzafa, in this topic of the floating Tumah. And the Mivneh, the structural note, highlights a double underline, which you'll see features the expression Im Tim Salomar. It's an abbreviated expression. The question format presents initially a question with 2 sides to it, and then the Gemara presents a second question. If you assume one approach, then I will present another question, and you see the mahu word is dashed, underlined. At that point, the second question is stated. And this is a repeating structure. Each time, new questions built upon the previous questions are presented, each one with 2 sides to it. When you get to number 5, the reason that there's a change in the style of numbering, of marking, it's because these questions are not built upon the first 4 questions. But all told, we have, it appears as 7 questions that have some connection to this topic of Tumah Tzofa. The Gemara. I don't know if I should spoil the fun ahead of time, but you'll notice that at the end of the long question, there's no answer. It ends off with a teku. The questions remain unresolved. But nevertheless, Boy Romi Barchamo. Now, we're making girsa changes here based on the Gra's amendations. The Rashi, and I believe the Tosfos have a different approach. We're going to follow the Gra in the Gemara, but having said that, the Gra's approach is that the din of Tumah Tzofa is sheretz related, and that's based on the Rambam. It's only sheretz related. Therefore, the questions focus on sheretz. The Gemara text itself, without his changes, make reference to other forms of Tumah, specifically mace, corpse material, in a Tumah Tzofa scenario. But we're going to follow, in our reading, we're going to follow the Gra. That's the convention that we chose here. So now the Gemara, Boy Romi Barchamo, sheretz. Notice that's a change already in our mark, in our amendations, based on the Gra. Sheretz bekli, a dead sheretz is in a vessel, kli tzof al panei hamayim, and the vessel is floating on water. And of course, there's a doubt: did I have contact with the sheretz? Mahu, is this a case of Tumah Tzofa? Bosar kli azlinan. Do I focus on the vessel? If I focus on the vessel, so then the sheretz is in effect lying still in the vessel. It's not floating. It's lying flat on the bottom of the vessel. So it's like it's on the ground. And if there's a doubt concerning maga, contact, we would rule tome. Oy basar maya azlinon. Or do we look at the broader picture and say, well, this whole entity is on water, so it is floating, and the sofek maga, doubt concerning contact with it, would result in a ruling of leniency. Im timtzilomar basar kli azlinon. If you take the approach, and again, it doesn't mean you have to take this approach, but the Gemara poses it as choosing one of the two sides. If you take the approach that will focus on the kli, on the vessel, and then that would mean we'll rule stringently in the case of doubt. Sheretz al gabi mace mahu. Let us say you have the piece of sheretz that's sitting upon a piece of, on a corpse that's floating on water, or on a piece of corpse material floating on water. And the doubt is with regard to, did I have contact with that sheretz? Mahu. Kevon, and again, we're working with the assumption in the previous question that the sheretz lying on the vessel is considered on the ground, it's considered stationary. What about in this case? Kevon dahai tumas erev ahai tumas shiva. Since the duration of the tumah that each one of these items generates is different. The sheretz is a tumas erev, means a person who becomes defiled because of contact with the sheretz, he remains defiled till sundown. The contact with the mace would result in a 7-day defilement period. So the mace, which is the base of this sheretz, upon which the sheretz is lying, is very different. So keman demachta tuma b'kli damya. It's viewed in our eyes as if the sheretz is in a vessel, and we would rule tuma. Again, the doubt here is with regard to, did I have contact with the sheretz? Oy dilma tuma smichtahi. Or do we say, no, it's one continuum of tumah. It's not like the vessel. The vessel itself doesn't have inherent defilement. Here you have two pieces that are one continuum of inherent defilement. Tumah smich means thick tumah, one thick piece, and therefore it would be viewed as tzof, as floating. And again, we take in this third stage the stringent approach. And if you say that we're going to view that case as well as if the sheretz, while lying on the mace, is lying on a vessel. Question 3, sheretz al gabi nevela v'nevela tzofa ma'u. Let's say you have a piece of sheretz lying on unslaughtered animal meat. Nevela is animal meat that was not slaughtered properly. A dead cow that's floating on the water. And I want to ask, what is the status of the sheretz in this case when a doubt concerns, did I have contact with it? Kevon de travayo tumas erev inun tumas michtahi. Since both have the same tumah duration, one evening, up 1 day tumah. So it's considered like one continuum, one thick continuum of tumah, and it would be considered like floating. And the doubt would result in leniency. Oy dilma. Or we are to emphasize a different aspect of things, and that tumas nevela hai kezayas. Nevela is metame, communicates tumah if you have an olive quantity of it, and vahai ke'adosha. And sheretz communicates tumah if you have even a much smaller amount, an adosha quantity. Adosha is sometimes translated as a lentil bean amount, but it's smaller than an olive quantity. And therefore, since they have this difference, the sheretz is considered like on a vessel. And again, we would rule stringently in a case of doubt concerning contact. Sheretz al gabi sheretz ma. What about this case, where you have a sheretz lying upon another sheretz? Hani vaday chad shiuroninu. Well, these seem to be certainly the same quantity, the same duration, the same amount, so it would be floating. Oh, dilma kevan de mifsiki mehadadi lo. On the other hand, since they're two separate pieces, mifsiki means they're separate from one another. It's true one is lying on the other, but they're separate things. So, the upper one is not considered floating. It's lying stationary on the lower one. Again, following the Gra, we are taking out from our reading the next 2 lines, and we start question number 5. Sheretz al gabi nevela shinimucha mahu. You have a piece of sheretz that's lying or floating on some dissolved or melted nevela. What is the din? Keva denemucha havyale mashke. Since the nevela, what was once meat, is now slimy, it's melted, it's considered a liquid, and the sheretz that's floating on this in this nevela slime is considered tumat safa, and the doubt concerning contact with the sheretz under these circumstances would result in leniency, tahara. Oy dilma, hai uchla hu. Or do we say that the slime essentially comes from food, and it's not considered floating, it's considered on the ground? The intim salomar de uchlahu, and if you take that approach, that, well, its origin, the nevela, is food, sheretz al gabi shichvas zera mahu. Let us say I have sheretz that's floating on shichvas. Shichvas zera is semen, male semen. We've been learning along with the Rambam, but I just want to point out that Rashi regarding this says that the shichva zera itself is floating on water, so that you have a piece of sheretz lying in we'll say a puddle of shichva zera. Now shichva zera, the semen is a thicker substance, so it will end up being, it's, as I say, it's thick. It itself is floating on the water. So the question now is, the sheretz, how are we to view it? Rashi presents the possibilities, and if we look in the Rashi, 4 lines from the bottom, sheretz sof al gabi shichva zera, the shichva zera sof al pnei amayim mahu, mi amrinon hoyel v'shichva zera lav uchlohu. Since shichva zera is not food, It's not parallel to the nevela that melted. Havile kemashke. Vavisheretz sof usfeiko tahor. There is another side, though, of the analysis, which the Gemara doesn't spell out, but it spells it out in its continuation of the question with the imtim tsolomar. If you go back to the Gemara text, you'll see the second side of the analysis here. V'imtim tsolomar kevon de misakro havile ki uchlo. Since the shichva zera comes from the human being, but it's not like, let us say, other liquids in a human being that assemble in an organ and then emerge, but rather it comes from the human flesh itself. That's the best I can do for right now. You can look into the Rashi, how he describes it, but the fact that the shichva zera and its origin and emission is different than other body fluids. The Gemara says, Kiva de misakra. Misakra literally means it's uprooted from the body, from the flesh of the person. Have le ki uchla. It is like food. And the sheretz that's sitting on top of the shichva zera would be considered stationary. That leads us into the seventh question. Sheretz al gabi mei chatos, or mei chatos sofen al gabi hamayim mahu. Let's say you had a piece of sheretz floating on the red heifer ash water mixture. Now that water is thick because it's mixed with the ash of the red heifer, of the paraduma. And that paraduma water is itself on top of regular water. On top of that, as we said, there is sheretz. Mahu, what is the din in that case? Lo yad inon. We don't have an answer. Teku, it remains unresolved. We continue now at the top of Omid Beis. Before we continue with the Gemara text, we glance at the side where we have a Nosay topic heading, Nazir v'oisa Pesach shoyu tamei meis. A Nazir, or someone on his way to do the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. These people had been tamei meis. V'higiu lezayin shalahem, and they reached the 7th day of Tumas Meis, that's the final day of the purification week. Ubo bayom, on that Yom Hazayin, holchu bekever hatahom. Here we're going back to a topic that we had discussed in our previous shiur at great length, the topic of the unknown Tuma, namely at the point of, we'll say, contact with it, or overshadowing of it. It was not known to anybody. Subsequently, it was revealed, and in our case, it was revealed that on that day that he was doing on the 7th day of his purification week, they had walked over an unknown grave, either the Nazir or the Osa Pesach. And once again, the Nazir we're talking about is a Nazir who had been Tomei Meis, and he was observing a week of cleanness, of purification. And on that 7th day, they encountered the Tumas Hatahom. And we're meeting the Nazir and the Osa Pesach a while later. In the case of the Nazir, for example, we're meeting him after he completes his Nazirus. What happens now? Did that encounter with the Tumas Hatahom affect him and make him count all over again? Let's see how the Gemara deals with this. Omar Rav Hamnuna, Nazir v'oisa Pesach, shaholchu bekever hatahom b'shvi shalahem. Tahorim, they are ruled to be unaffected. My taima. Why are they unaffected? The lo alima tumas hatahom lemistar. Tumas hatahom is not alima. Alima means strong enough. It's not potent enough a form of defilement to undo what they have done. Let us look at the Rashi together. Rashi on the top. Omar Rav Hamnuna, Nazir Pesach shenitmu b'tumas meis, v'huzalen b'shlishi b'shvi, and they were observing their week of purification involving the sprinkling of the red heifer ash water mixture on them on the 3rd and 7th days of that week. And they walked over an unknown grave. And we say unknown means at the time that they walked over it, it was unknown. It became known later on, but at that time it was unknown. On their 7th day, and it did not become revealed to the fellow doing the Pesach until he sacrificed his korban Pesach. As far as the Nazir is concerned, it became revealed to him after he finished observing his 30 days of Nazirus, taking the haircut, namely 30 days later. The Rashi continues Tohorim. Even though they encountered Tumah on their 7th day of their purification days, the lo alima Tumas Tom lemistar, Tumas Tom is not strong enough to undo what they had accomplished. We continue. Mosiv Rava. Yorad litoher mitumas meis, a person who descended into a mikveh to purify himself from death defilement, and there was discovered, it doesn't say in the words of the source, but Rashi points out the explanation, there was discovered later on some corpse flesh sunk into the floor of this cave. The cave in which he went for his immersion. There was a mikveh in the cave. It was discovered that there was some mace sunk into the ground of that cave. So the source tells us that he is tomei. Why? Shecheskas tomei. Someone who had been defiled, had the status of defilement, remains in that state. You see, we're not taking someone that is tohor and defiling him. He's a person that was in a state of defilement, and since he was already in that, we'll say that weakened state of being defiled, he cannot enjoy the benefits of tumas hatahom. Likewise, if the person had been went into that mikveh and he had been tohor, he went in, let's say, just to cool off, he wasn't tomei, then he would remain tor, shecheskas tor, tohor. Now what we have to focus on, though, is the statement in this source that for someone who had the status of tumah, who was seeking purification but was not yet there, the encounter with the tumas tahom prevents him from reaching purification at that point. That having been said, our case above, the Nazir and the Yosef Pesach, on their 7th day, they had not been tohor yet. They were on their 7th day. They don't become tohor until sundown. The Nazir on the 7th day had the red heifer water sprinklings on the 3rd and the 7th day, but on that 7th day, and we can see this in the Rashi explanation, he encountered the kever tahom before he took his haircut. So let's assume that he hadn't taken his haircut and the sun had not set. The haircut is after the mikveh that he must do on that 7th day. So they are still tomei. How can Rav Hamnuna say then that the kever hatom does not affect them and they can enjoy what they thought to be tahara, when their contact with the tumas hatom was at a point that they had not yet reached the status of tahara? Omar lei. So Rav Hamnuna responds, Modina loch benazir shemechusur tiglachas. I will concede to you that the Nazir is tomei. Since his contact with the tumas tahom on the 7th day of his purification week was before the haircut, he is considered defiled by that contact with the Tumas Tom. Even though he discovered this, we'll say, unfortunate story a month later, after he observed what he thought was his Nazirus de Tahara, his Nazirus impurity. Let's emphasize the point again. The Gemara says, Shemechusur tiglachas. He's missing an essential aspect of Nazir purification, the haircut that a Nazir takes at the end of the week of the clean week after defilement. So he hadn't yet done that, so he didn't really achieve Tahara. And therefore the Tumas Atom will have its defiling effect. And therefore, the Nazirus that he thought he was observing for that subsequent month doesn't count, because he didn't ever really become Tohar in order to start his Nazirus all over again. Omar le Rava. Now, Rava, who had raised the opposition to Rav Hamnuna, here Rava says, Af ano modino loch ba'oisa Pesach. I will concede to you that there is Tahara for the Oisa Pesach. What's the case of the Oisa Pesach? The 14th of Nisan represents the day on which we have to process a Korban Pesach. And this Oisa Pesach fellow had been Tomei Mace. And on that 7th day of purification, the fellow who thought he was going to be doing his Korban Pesach, he encountered Tumas HaTahom. And at what point did he encounter the Tumas HaTahom? During the 7th day. Let us make the assumption it was the 7th day after he immersed in the mikveh. Did he need to do anything else? No. So Rava says, in the case of the Oisa Pesach, in contrast to the Nazir who encountered the Tumas HaTahom before he took that final haircut, here a standard Tomei Mace doesn't have any haircut requirements. He has the Porah Duma water requirements, which he did already. He immersed in the mikveh. Let's assume that he immersed in the mikveh. That's already something we might touch on later. Why does Rava concede over here that the Tumas HaTahom does not affect him? The lo mechusar v'lo klum, because he's not missing anything. Amar le Abaye v'ho mechusar herav shemesh. Abaye says, but he hasn't had sundown yet. He experienced the Tumas HaTahom on his 7th day. In order to achieve Tahara, you need to have, besides everything we've said till now, you have to complete the 7th day with sundown following his mikveh. And he's missing that. Omar le, Rava says, Shimsho me'mei lo arva. The setting of the sun is not something that human beings have control over. It happens through the force of nature that God created. The Mela conveys that idea. Literally, it happens on its own. In contrast to the case of the Nazir and his haircut, which is something that a person initiates, had a person-based action not taken place yet, so the person is still viewed b'cheskas Tuma, having the status of Tuma, and therefore the Tumas HaTahom will have its effect of, let's say, extending the defilement. However, if the only thing that's missing is the setting of the sun, that doesn't bother us. It's considered as if nothing is missing. It's considered from our perspective that the individual achieved Tahara, and the Tumas HaTahom would not have any effect. So in this give and take, you notice Abaye initially was presenting Herav Shemesh as a missing action necessary for achieving Tahara. Rava said, no, it's not considered a missing action because Memela Arva. The Af Abaye Hodarbe, Abaye himself reverses his position to agree that setting of the sun, even though it's a necessary event for achieving absolute purification, it's not considered an action in our context with regard to enabling the Tumas Tom to have an effect. Now, notice with our markings, we have a long point marking. All of this is designed to convey the idea that Abaye Hodarbe, Abaye reversed his position. We'll see this at the end of the very long point, where in response to a question the Gemara raises, in fact, this very point of, isn't he missing HaRav Shemesh? We haven't mentioned what the point was, but in the context of the Gemara, Abaye's response is, HaRav Shemesh isn't a problem. The setting of the sun doesn't present a lack, because Memela Arva. So that very point that Rava makes now is something that Abaye himself adopts. And that's what we mean that Abaye Hodarbe. The approach that Amir Tzashem we're going to take with regard to this piece of Gemara from the beginning of the long point till the MIshna will be such that we'll read through the Gemara with little to no explanation, and then learn the Tosfos, the three Tosfos that will learn to serve as explanation of the Gemara. The reason for this is something characteristic of Maseches Nazir, and that the style, the give and take style, question answer, is not so, we'll say, obvious as it would be in other Gemaras. Before we begin the text, we glance at the side. We have a Tatnosay. This Tatnosay is a subheading, because we're within the general realm of what constitutes being within a period of Tumah and what constitutes having completed Tumah observance. The Tatnosay, the subtopic heading reads as follows, reading in the margin, Isha Sheyolda, a woman who gave birth. And in halacha, when we speak about giving birth, that includes miscarriages as well. A woman who gives birth or miscarries is obligated to bring a sacrifice. The type of, or the timing of the sacrifice is dependent on the gender of the child. A male birth requires a sacrifice to be brought 41 days after the birth, and a female birth 81 days after the birth. And when you look in the Gemara and the commentaries, you'll see the numbers presented in letter form. Mem Aleph is 41, Pei Aleph is 81. So the heading reads, the Isha Shiolda V'toch Melois Shel Leida Harishona Hipila. The term Melos means the completion days. We just gave an example of that. Female birth generates an 81-day period. During the 80 days, the woman is said to be Tomei. It's a low-level tumah that she has, but she's considered, in halachic terms, a Tvulas Yom Oroch. For our purposes, we're not going to burden ourselves with too many details, otherwise we'll get confused and lose sight of what the goal of our sugya is. So the woman spoken of here had a birth, let's say a female birth, and within those 81 days, in the middle of the time, on day 64, she had a miscarriage. V'toch melos shalei d'shniya, and then within 81 days of that miscarriage, aval achar melos shel rishona, hipila shlishis. There was a third miscarriage that took place within 81 days of that second birth, but the third birth was more than 81 days since the first birth. So you have this type of, if you want to use imagery, of time and physicality. Imagine a chain link, where you have a chain made of links, and the second link is interconnected with the first link, and the third link is interconnected with the second link, but has no contact with the first link. We know, as we said, that korbanos are required upon the birth, but not at the day of the birth, but at day 81, at the completion. We call it at the end of the Melois period. If a second birth takes place within the Melos period of the first birth, So there's no second korban that's generated. It's included in the korban that the first birth required. In fact, the second birth took place at a time when the woman could not have yet brought a sacrifice. She hadn't achieved full purification, enabling her to bring the sacrifice. She didn't reach day 81. So the second birth is included within the sacrifice of the first birth. What about the third birth? When the third birth takes place, on the one hand, it's more than 81 days from the first birth, so there's room to think that the third birth will generate its own sacrifice. On the other hand, the third birth takes place at a time that the woman could not yet have brought any sacrifices, because the tumah that's generated by birth was being prolonged, was being extended by these multiple births, third birth being within the malos of the second birth. Let us now turn to the Gemara text after having given this introduction. We mentioned that the point of this Gemara is to demonstrate that Abaye himself does a turnabout to agree with Rava that the setting of the sun is not considered an action per se, and therefore if a person did everything that a person's required to do in order to achieve purification, and the only thing that's missing is the setting of the sun, he is considered as having achieved purification. For our purposes, we were speaking about Tumas HaTahom, and we'll extend this idea a little bit more as we go on in the Gemara. So now the Gemara, after saying that Abaye did a turnaround, Desanya, Yoim Melois Tavi, Toich Melois Loi Tavi. A woman who had a miscarriage, a second birth, which was a miscarriage, after a birth, on day 81 of a first birth, she had a second birth, a miscarriage. That's Yom Melos, on day 81 of a female birth. If it was a male birth, it would be day 41, but that gets a little bit complicated with other details that we're not using over here. So the Yom Melos, for our purposes, and for our illustration, is day 81 after a female birth. There was a second birth, a miscarriage. So if the second birth, if the miscarriage takes place on day 81, Tavi. Tavi means the mother must bring a second sacrifice, second set of sacrifices that a yoledes, that a childbearing mother, a woman who bore children, must bring. So she has one set of sacrifices for the first birth, and then another set of sacrifices for the miscarriage that took place on day 81. However, if in the middle of those 81 days, meaning let's say on day 64, she has a miscarriage, that's toch malois, lo tavi. She doesn't bring a second sacrifice. Eventually, when she achieves purification, when she completes the 81 days from that second birth, she'll bring one sacrifice that will cover both births. Yachol tavi al leida shelifnei malois, avol tavi al leida sheleachar malois, v'tiftar mishnehem. Maybe it is so that one korban covers two leidos, two births. When the second birth was within the malos, was lifnei malos, means before the completion of the 81 days of the first birth, so one sacrifice is sufficient. However, if, as we illustrated before in our introduction, she has a third birth that is after day 81 from the first birth, that third birth, however, was within the malos of the second birth. Remember the chain analogy we gave? Could it be that in a case like that, she would bring two sacrifices? Talmud Lomar, uvimlois yemei tara, b'yom malos tavi, toch malos lo tavi. The only time an additional sacrifice is generated is if the second birth was on the Yom Malos, was on day 81, or afterwards, of course. But we're focusing right now on that day. It's very important for our illustration that the second sacrifice will be generated by a second birth or a miscarriage on day 81 of the first birth. However, Toch Malos, births that take place within the Malois days of the previous birth, no additional sacrifice is generated. Omar Rav Kahana. Now here, this statement is very, very difficult to translate as it is. When you look into Rashi and you see, he says, Klomar, meaning that just don't rely on the simple translation. But Rav Kahana is a comment on this source. He, according to Rashi, is coming to explain why Toch Malois, a second birth, Toch Malos does not mechayev, doesn't obligate her to bring another korban, whereas on the Yom Malos that would generate another korban. So Amar Rav Kahana, Shaini Hocha de Mechasra Korban. The reason that a Leda, a subsequent birth, a second birth within the Malos of the first birth, doesn't generate an additional korban is because at the time of that second birth, this woman could not yet have brought her sacrifice for the first birth. So the sacrifice for the first birth eventually is going to include that second birth. So that's Rav Kahana's explanation for the Toch Malos situation as not generating an additional sacrifice. Why? So we repeat ourselves, because the woman, having given birth to the second child, or the miscarriage, within the Malos period, hasn't finished, so to speak, her obligations for the first birth. And what does it mean she hasn't finished her obligations? It means she hasn't brought the sacrifice yet for the first birth. She couldn't have brought the sacrifice. It was Toch Malos. But if she has a miscarriage on day 81, then you're telling me she will have to bring a separate sacrifice? The Gemara asks, well, Hasam Nami, there too in the case of day 81, Mechasra Herav Shemesh. There's a very big discussion, it's quite a bristling discussion between the Meforshim that you see on the page right here in our Gemara. I'm going to present one scenario. I don't want to confuse. We're dealing with very new topics here, and I don't want any information overload to take place. So, one approach, you see this in the Rosh, I think you'll see this in the Tosefos also. We're dealing with a case of a woman who gave birth, and she did not go to mikveh as is ordinarily expected on day 14. She didn't go to mikveh on day 14. She delayed her mikveh experience until day 81. So you can have a situation where a woman reaches day 81, she goes to the mikveh then, and in order to achieve purification, she still has to have sundown take place. Why is it that we said that all births, regardless of what the woman did, when a birth takes place on day 81, she has to bring a separate korban. It's like a new time entity. She's completed her purification obligations regarding the first birth. But she hasn't. If you have a woman that after having given birth, even if it's 81 days ago, but she didn't go to mikveh, she needs to go to mikveh on that day, on day 81. And mikveh itself, mikveh immersion is not sufficient in order to achieve purification. You have to have sundown. Why then is it stated that if there's a second birth on day 81, she has to bring a new sacrifice? a separate sacrifice for that second birth. She's still bound to the first birth. Omar le Abaye Shimsho Memela Arva. The setting of the sun, that's nothing. That happens on its own. It's not considered as if something is lacking. Notice who is saying it? Abaye. It's my feeling at this point that most of the information that we would see in the Tosefos we've already explained sufficiently in the Gemara, and therefore we won't go through all of the Tosefos that we thought we would do, but we'll look at the third of the Tosefos that I wanted to do, Omar Abaye, or the Tosefos right before that, Hasam Nami Mechus HaRav Shemesh Kamo Vahavinan Ba. The Gemara here, it's Nazir, uses somewhat unusual language, says it Hasam Nami instead of what you would see in other Gemaras. Vahavinan Ba means and we ask. Hasam Baledish Lacham Alois, a birth that takes place on day 81. Amai Tavi Korban Leledish Shnia. Why does she bring a sacrifice for the second birth? Homachas HaRav Shemesh. Is she not lacking the setting of the sun? Are we not in fact talking about a woman that did not do the expected mikveh immersion after a mere 2 weeks? She delayed. She delayed till now, till day 81. Hare af la'achar shmoinim eino ruya lo havi korban leida rishona. Since she didn't go to mikveh yet on that day 81, and when she goes to mikveh, she still has to wait for the sunset. She's not fit for bringing sacrifices. She'll have to wait till the next day. And even so, she's going to bring a separate sacrifice. Even though, once again, we're repeating, even though she hasn't reached a point in time where she could have brought a sacrifice for the first birth. And yet, we say she brings a separate sacrifice. Omar Abaye, Shimshomeil Arva, Klomar, Lo Mibaya Chisaron Hatfila, She'eno Choshev Chisaron. And here is a point that we did not emphasize before. We might have even been a little misleading before. We've reached day 81. The woman has not yet, we said, had not yet gone to mikveh. You know what? We're on day 81, and she miscarries even before going to mikveh. So Tosfos says, Lo mibaya chisaron hatvila she'eno choshev chisaron she'mikveh lefanav yoda litbol. The lack of immersion that's not really a lacking. Why? Because the mikveh is in front of her. It's something in her power to do. And therefore, the miscarriage on day 81, whether it takes place before the mikveh immersion or after the mikveh immersion, we tell you she has to bring a separate korban. So, as far as the lack of mikveh immersion, that's not a lacking. Elo af HaRav Shemesh she'eno biyado, even the setting of the sun, which is not something you have control over, lo kachoshev chisaron, it's not considered a lacking. It's considered in our mind's eye as if it already took place. The Shimsha Memela Arva. The sun sets on its own through the laws of nature that God created. So at this point you see that Abaye himself adopted what Rava said earlier, that Shimsha Memela Arva and all that it implied earlier. We now have a new Mishnah, the Nosay, the topic heading, Hamotze Meis, V'achakach Od Meis. Person finds a corpse, and then finds another corpse. Mosai Nikba Dahavi Shchunas Kvoros, V'konu Mekoman. This is a new concept. Those of you who learn Maseches Bava Basra might recall that if you find 3 bodies that are lying next to one another in a space of between 4 and 8 amos, those bodies must remain where they are. You cannot transfer the corpse because those bodies represent to us that which might have been years and years before a formal cemetery. The cemetery discussed in our MIshna, our Gemara, is a cemetery that essentially is a connection of caves that are joined together by a common courtyard that are dug into the ground. It's subterranean. And the bodies that you found represented 3 bodies that, being the dimensions are, as we said, between 4 and 8 amos, bodies that would have been buried in crypts that are dug into the walls of a cave, of a burial cave. That is what's called Shchunas Kvoros that we just mentioned. That's by way of very general introduction. Let's turn to the MIshna. Hamotzi meis mushkov kedarko notlo v'es tfusaso. If a person finds a body that's lying in a normal burial fashion, normal direction, the Gemara will be analyzing each one of these words, what they come to, let's say, exclude. For the meantime, we can get by with a translation, and one finds a body lying in the ground. Not lo vesfusosa means you take the body and the surrounding earth. The Gemara itself will deal with how much earth will you be taking with the body, but that's what fusosa means, the ground that is connected or grabbed up together with the body. Now, you're probably wondering, what are we talking about? Moving bodies? Can't the guy be left there to rest in peace? So, let's take a look at Tosfos. Note lo, Rashi, the Tosfos we're looking at is in the lower part of the page. Note lo, nihi de kever hayodua minon beperik nigmar din. Granted that a known grave, as is taught in Masechah Sanhedrin, in that parak called Nigmar Adin, also lefanos. You can't move graves. You can't move bodies from where they're buried. That's a case where you knew the person was buried there deliberately to remain there. Avol benimtza, where you happen to chance upon a body. Amrinon hasam muter litlo. We say there that you're allowed to take it, to transfer its location. Me'achar shelo noda hakever livnei adam. It was a body found, and it wasn't a known grave to other people. Nochon lomar ki lakroi nikbar sham. It's therefore within the realm of reason for us to say it was buried there. Lakroi means like by happenstance, maybe you could say temporarily, and not buried there for the purpose of remaining specifically there. So in the absence of, we'll say, positive knowledge that it was buried there with the purpose of remaining there, you have a right to move it. Move it to, of course, to a proper cemetery. The MIshna continues. Shnayim, if you found 2 bodies, note one, v'es tfusasa. Motza shlosha, if you found 3 bodies. Im yesh bein zeh lo zeh midalet amas at shmoina, harei shchinas kvoros. If you found 3 bodies lying side by side next to each other, with little gaps between them, we're not talking about bodies found in a mass grave. We're talking about 3 bodies buried next to each other in a separate fashion within a space of between 4 and 8 amos. Harezu shchunas kvoros, that constitutes what we will call, loosely translated, a graveyard, a proper cemetery. And what does that mean? You can't move them. After finding the 3 bodies, we explained in our introduction that the 3 bodies may have been buried in one of the walls of a cave. Right now, because of soil erosion and other geological conditions, it doesn't appear anymore as a cave, so that everything looks different. But in your mind's eye, you have to imagine that these 3 bodies you found were actually buried. There actually had been either a side wall or a back wall of a cave, and these caves had very specific dimensions. We might make reference to them shortly. In Maseches Bava Basra, the sugya appears in a much more elaborate fashion. So having found the 3 bodies, we suspect that, as we said, it's part of burial cave. And if you look at we continue at the top of Daf Samach Omed Aleph, we have an illustration. This is a partial illustration. First of all, it's a bird's eye view. You're looking from top down. What you're looking at in the illustration you see on the top corner essentially is really underground. So there's a chutzner, like an open air chutzner, literally is a courtyard, a little open area, but it's beneath ground surface. It's open air though, and from there are entrances into Ma'oros or burial caves. The illustration that you see here could have been more elaborate, but if you want to see more information, you can look at the reference to the Gemara in Bava Basra. But for our purposes, this will suffice, just to give you a feeling. And we're going to give you numbers also. The numbers are presented here superficially. The length of the Ma'ora is assumed to be 8 amos. The chotzer is measured 6 by 6 amos, so it has a length of 6 amos. And the opposite cave also has a length of 8 amos. So if you find 3 bodies, they might be the far wall of one of the caves. So now you're going to have to check. Now the MIshna says, let's read the top line of the MIshna. Boide keimenu lahalon esrim amo. You have to check 20 amos away from there. You have to keep checking for a distance of 20 amos because you might find more bodies. And now, how do you figure the 20 amos? You don't see that in the illustration. Here, I don't want to get too bogged down with details, but you're going to be starting at that, we'll say, imagining that the 3 bodies you found were the far wall of one cave. Then you'd be measuring 8 amos in a particular direction, considering that would be the length of the cave. Another 6 amos, factoring the chotzer, that's 14 amos. There's a balance of 6 amos, and that we don't have illustrated here how you get to the 6 amos, but be that as it may, it's an additional consideration for finding a second cave, an opposite cave of bodies. So the MIshna tells us that after finding the 3 bodies, you have to do that checking for a distance of 20 amos. Motza echod b'soif esrim amo. If you find another body 20 amos away, bodek heimenu lalon esrim amo. You have to check another 20 amos for more bodies. And now the idea here of finding an isolated body after having found 3 bodies, how do we treat that isolated body? We leave it there. Sheraglayim ladovar. That means we have literally there's grounds for the matter, grounds for suspicion. Once you found 3 bodies, that conjures up the possibility that it might be a cave. The next body you find within 20 amos is another body found in what was once part of this burial cave network. And the MIshna says, She'ilu tchila motzo, had you found that isolated body before finding the 3 bodies, what is it then? It's like we saw in the first part of the MIshna. Not lo ves fusos, you would have taken it together with the surrounding dirt. But since you found this isolated body after having found the 3 bodies that we imagine as being part of a burial cave, you can't move this 4th body that you found 20 amos away. The Gemara is going to be darshaning the words of the MIshna. We've underlined them, so if you just read the underlined words, the next 2 lines, you see the words motza, meis, mushkav, kadarko. Those are words quoted from our MIshna. So what does each word represent? Omar of Yehuda, motza, prat, lemotsui. We look in the Tosfos, motza, prat, lemotsui, pirush ri, shimhoyo yodua, lo yehe not lo. If you knew that someone had been buried there, the body that you found was known to have been buried there with intent to remain there, you wouldn't take it. Kinami perk nigmar din, kever hanimtza mutu lefanoso, kever hayodua asu lefanoso. A kever of grave that you chanced upon wasn't known to be a grave there, that you can remove. And that's what the word motza means. You chanced upon it. Not motsui, not something that was known to have been there. The next word, we go back to our Gemara, mace. You found a person that died naturally, prat lahorug, to the exclusion of the case of you found a murder victim. If you found a murder victim, then the laws of the MIshna of taking the body with the surrounding dirt would not apply. The Rashi points out, Meis prat lahorug, shimotza echad meguyod o shloshta meguyodin. If you found a body that was cut into pieces, or that all three were, then Amrinon dahachi yisrami shinergu lisham v'nikpuru b'mekoymon shobes hakvoros v'lo machzikinon like yeshunas kvoros ela notlon ve'as tfusasan. There we would say that the law of Shchunas Kvoros would not arise because they must have been buried there temporarily. They were murdered and just left there temporarily, not with the intent of that being a cemetery. We continue in the Gemara, Mushkov Prat Liyoshev. You found a body lying, not a body that was buried in a seated fashion. If you found a body in a seated fashion, then the law of our MIshna wouldn't apply. An application of this exception would be, imagine you find two bodies normally buried, in a lying position, and a third body in a seated position. We will tell you that the din of Shchunas Kvoros, the law of our MIshna, does not apply, and that you in effect would be able to remove all three bodies. Later, the Gemara will ask, why is this? Kedarkoi prat l'sheroishe munach bein yirei chosav. Buried in a normal fashion, with the exception of, in other words, excluded from kedarka would be a body with its head between its knees, between its thighs. Toni ula bar chanina meis shechoser ein lo tfusa v'lo shchunas kvoros. If you find a body that is missing, it's an incomplete body, it's missing a limb, then when you move it, you don't move it with the surrounding dirt. You don't have to remove the tfusa. And if you find three bodies, one of whom is missing, then the law of shchunas kvoros doesn't apply either. The Tosfos mentions these laws are difficult to understand why we make these distinctions. Maybe it's all part of an oral tradition from Sinai. The Gemara asks, V'chol hani mai time alo? Why do we say in all of these cases that you will not create a shchunas kvoros? We illustrated before, if you find three bodies, but one of them is in a seated position, or one of them is buried with its head between its knees, why does that not constitute a third body for shchunas kvoros purposes? Answer, Amrinon, Dilma Oived Koichavimhu. We suspect that maybe it's an idol worshipper that was buried there, so that you wouldn't have then a din of three Jewish bodies, creating a law of shchunas kvoros of a Jewish cemetery. The Tosfos points out that Jews don't bury their dead in seated positions or in with head between legs position, so that it creates quite a level of suspicion that this is not a Jewish corpse, and therefore the number of bodies that are Jewish that are there are only two, and there would be no restriction then in moving them, because we haven't created the basis for considering a shchunas kvoros. There's a framed section, you notice it's a dashed frame, so we noted on the side, Tamliz Gerasim Kuvkov, the reason for this being a dashed frame, we don't have an opening expression here indicating that this is a Tanaic source. You would have, in other occasions, you have a word like Tanya or tonu rabbanon. Here you don't have any opening expression. Avo behemshech hadvorim uva maisim Rabbi Sheva Rabbi Kiva shoyim gedolei hatanoim. But as we go on in the source, you're going to see, you go on in this section, a story involving Rabbi Yeshevov and Rabbi Akiva, who were from the greatest of the Tanoim. So we can assume this is a section that is associated with, we'll say, Tanaic literature. The Gemara continues. Motzo shnayim rosho shel zeh b'tzad margaloisav shel zeh v'rosho shel zeh b'tzad margaloisav shel zeh. For the explanation that we want to offer for this piece of Gemara, I'm relying in part on the commentary of the Orach Meishor that you find in the back of Shas Gemaras. You found two bodies. Let me suggest you found two bodies, 2 out of 3 bodies. We have a crude illustration to go along with this piece of Gemara. It's not a Picasso or a Matisse, but it will do for crude illustration sake, for purposes anyway. The normal way of burial would be, in the case of 3 bodies that are buried side by side, heads of each one next to each other, and as a result, the feet of each body next to the feet of the neighboring body. In our case, there were 3 bodies, but 2 of them were found head next to feet and feet next to head. And that's what this opening line means. Motza, read again. Motza shnayim, found 2 bodies. And I'm saying 2 of the 3 bodies. Rosh shel zeh b'tzad margloisav shel zeh. The head of body 1 was next to the feet of body 2. The Rosh shel zeh, and the head of body 2, b'tzad margloisav shel zeh, were next to the feet of body 1. There might have been a 3rd body that was buried parallel to one of those bodies in a normal way. Nevertheless, this isn't a normal way of burial, and therefore ein lohem tfusa v'lo shchunas kvoros. You're going to be able to move them without having to worry about moving the surrounding dirt, nor will the 3 bodies buried in this fashion constitute a shchunas kvoros. Motza shlosha. You found 3 bodies. Ha'echad yodua u'shnayim tchila. O echad tchila u'shnayim yeduim. You found 3 bodies, but they weren't all 3 just chanced upon. One of them was known to have been buried there. 2 you in fact chanced upon, or the other way around. Ein lohem tfusa ve'ein lohem shchunas kvoros. So the rules of taking the surrounding dirt with them don't apply, and we are not going to establish a shchunas kvoros in a case like that. The Tosfos comments on this. He has 2 approaches. Let's take a look at the Tosfos together. At the end of the narrow lines, Echad yedua shnayim hu moitzei ato betchila. One was known from beforehand as being buried there, and 2 you just chanced upon. Ein lo shchunas kvoros. Rashbam Pirish, the Rashbam approach to this is halacha l'Moshe miSinai hu. It's an oral tradition. It's not necessarily based on logic. It's a given. The Re Pirish Tam B'Dover. The Re says there is logic behind this. The Ein Lanu Lomar Shchunas Kvoros Ubeisa Kvoros Hoya. It's not likely that this was a formal cemetery. Hayol v'niglu sham shloisha mesim, just because 3 were buried there, kevan de'echad nodat chila, since one, and I might emphasize only one of them, was known from beforehand, 1 or 2 known from beforehand. Isa the ein daito hoya lefanosam v'lishoyer sham bekivram. If it were so that all 3 were buried there deliberately to remain there and not be moved, just like one was known, so the other 2 would have been known as well. The rule of Shchunas Kvoros is stated only if you have 3 that were known to be buried there, and then you certainly could not move them. And according to what Tosfos implies, you'd have to also search the 20 amos in their vicinity, or if you found 3 bodies for the first time. We continue in the Gemara. Ma'aseh Rabbi Yeshevov shebodak umotza shnayim yiduim ve'echad tchila was an incident where Rabbi Yeshevov was checking out. He found 2 previously known bodies to have been buried there, and one no one knew about. He chanced upon the 3rd body for the first time. Ubikesh la'asos Shchunas Kvoros, and Rabbi Yeshevov wanted to declare this a Shchunas Kvoros. They are to remain there with all the laws we mentioned above. Omar lo Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva responds and says, Kol shiogata, all of your efforts, lo rik yogata, they were for naught. Lo omru Shchunas Kvoros elo shloisha tchila. The Gra takes out the phrase that we actually saw in the Tosfos. So, leaving it as the Gra reads it, the din of Shchunas Kvoros is stated only with regard to 3 bodies that you happen to chance upon, as opposed to what happened with Rabbi Yeshevov, that he didn't chance upon for the first time all 3. He chanced upon one. The other 2 having been known from beforehand as having been buried there deliberately. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.
This was a presentation of the Daf Map. We hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to be informed of our other videos. For resources and more information, please visit our website at www.thedafmap.com.